Hi everyone, welcome to week 2. I've been forgetting the hats, but the hat is back. So this week we're looking at the concept of culture. This is based on chapter 2 in the textbook, Why is the Concept of Culture Important? And my daylight quiz deadline is Thursday at the end of the day. So let's get started. What the heck is culture? It's one of those terms where we all have kind of a pretty good idea of what it is because we all grow up exposed to at least one culture, sometimes many, right? Depending on our family situation and where we live. So there are many definitions. Different anthropology textbooks will have different definitions, and the one that the authors of our textbook use is they define cultures as sets of learned behavior and ideas that humans acquire as members of a society, together with the artifacts and structures we create and use. I find that a bit fancy schmancy. Sometimes I just refer to culture as a set of beliefs and practices learned and shared by a group. But they're essentially saying the same thing. What I think is more important than having a definition is looking at the aspects of culture. And we'll follow along with our textbook in this. So they talk about culture as being learned, right? So we're born with our biology, because of how our brains are and things like that. We have a biological capacity for culture, but we're not born knowing a culture, right? It's something that we learn. It's not instinctive. So they talk about two ways in which we learn culture, and it's kind of interesting to make those little distinctions. But they're subtle distinctions. So they talk about socialization, and you might have heard this term in a sociology class if you've taken one, even in psychology. It's pretty much how we learn our social roles within a group. So who are we in relation to other people? So sometimes you'll hear about gender socialization, for example, or what's appropriate for your age. And it's kind of very subtle, right? Sometimes people will come out and say, hey, boys don't cry, and girls this, or, you're too young for that. But often it'll be these very subtle messages. Things are taken away from you, or you're mocked, or something, right? It's not always fun. Enculturation is similar, but it's more about how we learn the ideas of our culture. So there's overlap, because when it comes, for example, to gender socialization, that has a lot to do with the ideas our culture has about what's appropriate. What does it even mean to be a woman or a man? Is there such a thing as people that are both or neither, male or female, or all those things? What's proper sexuality, right? So what's right and wrong, and how do we do things? So like table manners, for example, come up in the textbook. And again, enculturation, some of it happens through direct instruction. People will tell you, well, you need to know this, but a lot of times it's just subtle. You make a mistake and then people correct you, or in different ways, or you observe and you learn, and you observe and you trial and error. So these are some ways in which we learn our culture from other people with whom we share a culture, right? So generations before us, or people that are of our generation, we share a culture with them. So these ideas and practices that compose a culture, they're shared by a group. So this doesn't mean that everybody agrees on everything. So in every culture, people will have slightly different interpretations and ways of practicing their culture. But the basics of it are shared with people, and the basic understandings are shared, even when people disagree or interpret them slightly differently. Okay? Humans are fun. It also doesn't mean nothing ever changes, right? So people share a culture, but then, because people adapt, humans adapt, and culture is adaptive, well, then cultures change too. So, and I'm putting that under shared because then where conflicts happen often within a culture is that speed of change, and whether change is appropriate or not, and how is that change going to happen. So it becomes tricky where culture is shared and people have different ideas of what's the appropriate way to move forward. Sometimes that can be between generations, but not always. Um, Individuals can have their own patterns of thought and behavior, but and they're influenced by whatever cultures we're exposed to and that we grow up in, but those individual patterns aren't a culture on their own. For something to count as a culture, it has to be shared between a group of people. the textbook talks about culture being patterned. And what they're referring here to, it's this subtle thing, but it's basically when we talk about culture, being patterned, it's you have these beliefs and practices that kind of go together and that you'll find in different areas of life. So one example is how, in a society that has a heavy political hierarchy, well, the ideas behind that hierarchy, where some people are more deserving of power than others, will reflect economic disparities, because often those people that are seen as more deserving of power are also seen as more deserving of wealth. Not always, right? Those things don't, power and wealth don't always line up, actually, and we'll talk about that later on in the semester. But that's one example. But sometimes there are contradictions, and so they point out you've had, this is blatant in European societies where, the dominant religion of Christianity would be saying share, 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 but wealthy people really, the political ideology was not all about sharing. It was more about hoarding. So, go figure. Culture is also adaptive. We talked about adaptation briefly earlier. So cultural practices generally help people survive in specific environments. So, if a physical environment, so the natural environment around people, or the social environment, which is, the people that are around, the other societies around, when there are changes in that, then culture will adapt to those changes. And not necessarily in this linear way, but little changes will happen. So yeah, cultural practices are adaptive, but when we say that, though, again, this part here, the specific environment, is very important to keep in mind, because what that means is that adaptation is very specific, and to a specific environment, meaning that it might not make sense in all contexts. So if you see something and you're like, it doesn't make sense to you, well, you have to think about how it makes sense in that particular cultural context, okay? It's not going to look the same everywhere. That's why there are different cultures, there are different places and different things to adapt to. And that aspect of adaptation really applies to all elements of culture, so social organization and so forth. And we'll talk about that more when we get to that point later in the semester, where we look at, well, if you're in an environment where there's no fertile soil to grow things, well, maybe it's more adaptive to follow migratory animals and, move around for part of the year. And if you're going to do that, it's adaptive to have smaller groups of people because it's and less stuff, because it's easier to move around. And if you have a smaller population, it makes more sense to have consensus, decision making by consensus, instead of having one boss that decides everything for everybody. And family is going to be affected by that, and how much people share instead of hoarding, and all these things. So it's kind of like this chain of adaptation. And it's most apparent in material culture. So when we talk about adaptation through culture, there's all this stuff, like we were saying, how people get their food, how they organize their society, but also the technology that people use. So when we talk about material culture, there was the word artifacts in that definition of culture from the textbook. It's those things. Material culture is the things that people make or modify, right? So, if people take a stone and they chip it a certain way to make a spearhead, well, that's material culture. And they use these things. So it's like all of our technology, so our chairs, our pens, our phones, the thing that we're communicating through right now. So this is material culture. And that's kind of the most apparent way that we see cultural adaptation. And it's why archaeologists who are dealing with cultures that no longer exist, cultures way in the ancient past, that they're often able to piece together important parts of culture and their people's old adaptations based on material culture. Culture is also symbolic. And what's a symbol? We've probably all heard that word. A symbol is anything that represents something else. But often people think a symbol is like a little, like a little symbol on a bathroom door, like the little person, and this is the bathroom, right? So that sign symbolizes a bathroom. In some places it's WC, right? But anything can be a symbol. So it can be an image, it can also be a word. So when we talk about linguistic anthropology later on down the line, we're going to talk about words as symbols. So a word, if I say the word cat, there's no cat. Well, some of you might have a cat where you are, but normally we're in a cat room and we look around and there's no cat. But, you know, if we share a language, we share a set of symbols that is a language, and that symbol will represent that animal, that feline animal with the pointy ears that goes meow, and it's really cute, but sometimes they're stinky. A gesture can be a symbol. We all know some gestures that, you know, some of them are nice, some of them are less nice. You know, if you drive in Montreal, there's a common gesture that a lot of us use when we get frustrated. And it symbolizes our wrath and our annoyance at people not turning their flashers on, for example. An action, you know, so in ritual behavior, for example, there are actions that symbolize certain things. So culture is symbolic in that, you know, we talked about learning culture earlier through enculturation. A lot of it happens at the symbolic level, because we use symbols to think, we use symbols to communicate, and you know, when we talk about evolution, this becomes a key part of our evolution, and it's really exciting. Some non-human primates show signs of culture. So yeah, so we'll talk a little bit in the weeks to come about primatology, which is a subfield within biological anthropology, and primatologists look at our close relatives in the animal kingdom, which is other primates, and the closer they are to us, like our closest relatives, chimpanzees and bonobos. Then you have gorillas, who are a little bit more distanced, but still pretty close. They're all great apes, and you know, they show signs of culture, and you know, some of them use tools, and they can learn some sign language, and you know, things like that. Some of them rip twigs off of sticks and use them to fish for ants or termites in the ground. That's tool use. That's material culture. So that's interesting, because it says a lot about you know, where our culture might have originated before we even split from those relatives. And so the fact that these non-human primates are capable of thinking symbolically and using symbols to communicate is a clue. Culture and nature. So there's a little box on page 27 in their own words. I forgot some quotation marks. Bad Jackie. But it's an anthropologist talking about this relationship between culture and nature. And I just wanted to say a quick word about it, because it's interesting. You might have heard the whole nature versus nurture debate when it comes to things like gender or other things. You know, is this natural? Is it cultural? Well, you know, anthropologists, you know, I wish more people listened to us, because really nothing is just one thing. So even things things that we see sometimes as purely biological, walking and talking, we're wired to be able to do those things, but we learn to do them culturally. So a baby learns to walk through cultural interaction with whoever's taking care of them and encouraging them to walk. And so there's that aspect, but even how to walk properly, right? If you were brought up in a family or in a context where you had to walk with your back straight and you had to take a certain stance, this is also a very gendered thing. Do you swing your arms? Like, what do you do when you walk? Do you take small steps, big steps? Do you walk fast? Do you walk slow? There are subtle cultural teachings about these things, right? What message you're conveying. So how you walk can be a symbol, right? Do you walk and you look confident, or do you walk and you look like scared? Talking. We're biologically wired to be able to talk because of how our brain works and because of our throat structure, with some exceptions. Again, these, you know, there are individuals sometimes who have different capacities around this. It's important to remember, but in general, we're wired to be able to do these things at a biological level. But again, talking is something we learn in a cultural way. So it's always important to kind of, you know, remember that anthropology takes those things into account and how they relate to each other. And also, our cultural understanding shapes what we consider to be natural. And this is a big topic. We'll come back to it when it comes to worldviews. And again, it's very relevant to gender, but also ideas around race, ideas around reproduction. So there's a nice quote here from that section where they say the problem is not that culture corrupts our understanding of nature. It is that culture is integral to understanding nature. So we are cultural beings, so our observations of nature will always be shaped by our cultural understanding. More on that. It's a complex thing. The textbook talks a little bit about human agency, because sometimes when we talk about culture, it's easy to see it as something that people are trapped by. And that's not really the case. Humans have agency everywhere, some level of control over their own lives. It's more apparent in some cultures than others. In the West, there's a push towards individualism, and sometimes people kind of poo-poo on cultures that are more collectivists, and it's not that black and white. So in every cultural context, people find ways to balance their social and cultural obligations with their own goals and desires, and sometimes this can be in subtle ways that no one else will ever see. So the whole collectivism versus individualism, the textbook doesn't really talk about that, but I'm bringing it up because I think it's important. It's not a strict divide. There's a whole spectrum there. And for example, there are places where collectivism is important because you have responsibilities towards other people. You're interdependent. What you do will affect them. But in the end, you still have the autonomy to decide whether you're going to do what's right or what's not right. Okay, so it's not just a clear-cut case of extreme collectivism where you have no personal freedom and hyper-individualism where you have all the freedom, because both of these are illusions. Even in our hyper-individualistic society in the West, we're still constrained by a lot of things. Holism, we touched on this last week, especially with regards to the connections between biology and culture, but it really is about everything. So everything is connected, and in anthropology we take that very seriously. So, in anthropology, the holism is a perspective that considers different aspects of the human experience and how they're integrated with each other. So biology and culture is one example, and we'll be going more into that in the next few weeks as we talk about evolution. Mind and body, so how we think and feel is connected to what our bodies experience in the world, and they talk about that in psychology as well. A person and their society are interconnected. Again, you have that whole collectivism to individualism spectrum. Humans and their environment and different elements of culture. So this kind of stuff here will come up more later in the semester when we talk about things like social organization. Culture shock. So the textbook doesn't use this term, but they talk about cultural differences and how, because they lead up to this with this talk of cultural patterns, and cultural patterns can help distinguish between different cultural traditions and different cultures, and you can kind of do that whole comparison thing. And, but I find that what they're touching on this idea of culture shock when they're talking about how people react to cultural differences and understand things differently. So culture shock is probably something everybody's felt at some point. You don't have to travel internationally. You don't have to go very far to experience culture shock. It can be just going to a different neighborhood in Montreal. Maybe you went to a friend's house for dinner at some point in your past, and maybe their family was from a different culture than yours, and they ate different food, and they ate it differently with different implements. And if you haven't been exposed to that, that can be sometimes what people consider good to eat. So at the beginning of chapter 1, there was this anecdote about the anthropologists were in a place where people made kind of paste out of termites. And so if you're not from a culture where this is a common practice, food, we have this very visceral reaction to food, right? If it's food we're not used to eating, we can feel this disgust, right? And so if we're somewhere where this is common, we might feel like intense culture shock and feel very uncomfortable, or people are wearing different kinds of clothes. But there are deeper examples than this, and I really like that example that they give on page 29, where you had members of the Peace Corps that were spending time in Botswana, which is a country in southern Africa, and most of the people from the Peace Corps, I think, were North American. And they were used to this idea that, you know, if you need alone time, you go off and sit by yourself and people will understand that you're just taking some alone time. But the people from the local culture, in the village where they were, to them, like, alone time means, if only, I think the way they said it in the text is like, if you wanted alone time, it was a sign that you were either a witch or suffering from a mental illness. And so they had gotten to know these people from the Peace Corps, and they're like, well, they're not witches, and I don't think they have a mental illness, so, you know, maybe they were insulted by someone, so I'm going to go sit with them and make sure they're okay. And so the Peace Corps people were annoyed because they're like, what do you need to do to get some alone time around here, right? So there was culture shock on both sides there. And again, the textbook doesn't introduce this term yet, worldview, but it's very relevant here because how we understand and interpret the world around us is influenced by our culture, it's shaped by our culture, or cultures in some cases. Again, a lot of people are exposed to multiple cultures in their homes. And, you know, it's really has this very deep effect because we don't go around thinking about it, but it still affects everything that we understand about the world. And all those little instinctive things and the incidences of culture shock is because our worldview is shaken up. This isn't that important. So it's there in the slides, it's there in the textbook, but there's a distinction between culture as a human capacity for culture and cultures, which is what we've been talking about so far in this chapter of sets of beliefs and practices. But what's important, very important to me, that students in my classes all know, is that, you know, maybe 100 years ago anthropologists did this, you know, whole thing with civilized versus primitive cultures, but we don't do that anymore. And it's very ethnocentric to do it. What's ethnocentrism, you may ask? I'm glad you asked. So ethnocentrism, I always get mad at our textbooks. Our textbooks all do this thing where they define ethnocentrism as what this second bullet here says, the second sub-point, that viewing other cultures as inferior to one's own, or assuming one's culture is the only proper way to do things, the only correct ones. That's one version of ethnocentrism. But what ethnocentrism actually means, and this is not in your textbook, and I think it should be, and someday I'm going to write my own damn textbook, is that what ethnocentrism actually is the tendency that we all have, because all humans are ethnocentric, is this tendency that we have to interpret everything that we see according to our own worldview. So if we see an unfamiliar practice, we're interpreting it automatically according to the only framework that we have to interpret things, which is our own worldview, that of our own culture, or again, cultures. And it's just this kind of, it's this thing that we do. You know, we can't, to survive in the world as individuals, we can't spend our time questioning everything. We make assumptions. And a lot of the times that's helpful, sometimes it's not. So with ethnocentrism, unfortunately, what that leads to is misunderstanding. So if you see people doing something, it's unfamiliar, and you're making assumptions about what they're doing based on your understanding of the world, one possible result of that is that you might see them as inferior because clearly they're doing things wrong, because they're not doing things the way that you were brought up to think they should be done. And often that comes linked with xenophobia, racism, other kinds of bigotry. And sometimes, though, can lead to, and that's what I find is missing in the standard textbooks definitions of ethnocentrism, is that sometimes people are well-intentioned, so to speak. They don't see themselves as discriminatory. They'll actually glorify a culture, and they can still be ethnocentric because sometimes we think we understand and we think, oh wow, what they're doing is so cool because it represents this thing, and you might be all wrong because you might not have taken into account of how, people explain their own practice. So ethnocentrism can lead to things that on the surface might not look negative, like exoticizing people or glorifying their culture, but it's still ethnocentrism. And most of the time we don't even know that we don't know. We don't know that we're misunderstanding. So it's not something, it doesn't make you a bad person. We're all ethnocentric. That goes with the territory of having culture and of having a worldview. But in anthropology, it's dangerous because it can lead to false information and misrepresentation. So what we try to do instead is practice cultural relativism. And what that means is that we try to understand a cultural practice in its own cultural context. So it might not make sense at first to you when you see people, for example, if you're from a North American culture and you read about people who practice some form of polygamy, either polygyny, where, multiple women can share a husband, or polyandry, where a woman might have multiple husbands, and you just think this is wrong because, oh my god, right? You were raised in a culture where monogamy is the only way. But then if you learn more about those cultures in question and you start to understand how those practices make sense with the political systems that they have, with the rest of their social organization, then it's like, oh, okay, it makes sense in that context. It's adaptive in that context. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. It doesn't mean you have to like it. It doesn't mean you have to agree with it. It doesn't mean you have to start doing it. And there's a discussion, and I'm not going to get into it in these slides because it's very complex, and I'd advise you to read this section with caution, because it's easy to get very emotional about this topic, so try to kind of put those emotions aside just for a little bit. Easier said than done, I know, and just kind of read till the end, because the authors aren't saying, female genital, I don't like to call it mutilation, but that's what a lot of people call it, female circumcision, it's an emotional topic, and they're not saying that it's a good thing that people do this, but anthropologically they're able to look at, for the people who do it, what's their rationale, and how does it touch on other aspects of their cultures, and also how can we, as people from outside those cultures, follow the leads of people within those cultures who are trying to change the practice. So that's involved in cultural relativism as well, because when people from the outside try to change something in the name of human rights, people within a culture will, understandably be resentful. And so culture change, the best forms of culture change come from within a culture, and within, we already said, just because a culture is shared, it doesn't mean everybody sees things the same way. So cultures where this happens, there are people within those cultures that are trying to change things, and in a lot of cases have been successful. So, that discussion, involves some cultural relativism in terms of understanding, well, where does this even come from, and why does it make sense? You don't have to like it. We're not saying, go out and do this or support it. You can still disagree with this practice, but you can kind of try to look at the internal logic of it. An analogy I like to make with ethnocentrism versus cultural relativism is that, say you go to a hockey game, which is something that I probably won't do. It's not my thing. Unless I know the people who are playing, then it's fun. And that's for all sports. We all have our things. But if you go see a hockey game, if you watch it on TV, whatever, and if you're trying to understand what the players are doing, but you don't know the rules, some of it is obvious. You're trying to score a goal, right? But sometimes there are some subtle little things. But then you're familiar with the rules of baseball, and you're trying to understand, well, why aren't they running around in a diamond? Why do they keep going back and forth across this arena? I don't understand. Well, that's kind of like ethnocentrism, because you're applying the rules of one sport to a different sport. If you're using the rules of hockey, you learn the rules of hockey so that you can understand what the hockey players are doing. That's kind of like cultural relativism. It doesn't mean you have to like hockey. It just means you're trying to understand what's going on here. Power and culture change. So throughout the chapter, and we're going to wrap this up here, but culture changes. We've already seen that, cultures adapt, things change around them, they adapt, but sometimes there are things that unfortunately force change, and there's a word missing there, that first bullet. So this thing here, settling an area and taking over an indigenous population, the word colonization, it used to be up here, then I added stuff, so this is, I'll change it, I'll fix it. This should say colonization. And so with colonization, you have societies that come in, and what's still happening here 500-600 years later in North America, where you had settler nations, several of them, British and French up here in the north. Further south you also had the Spanish, the Dutch, some others tried but didn't get that far. But they, essentially took over, stole land and resources. That's still happening. The Canadian government is still stealing land from Indigenous people. Forced assimilation and cultural destruction, sometimes bringing, not just sometimes, always carrying illness and death with it. People die from colonization even today. So we'll get into that more at some other time. And so these are things that can impact cultures, and cultures sometimes change in response to colonization. There's also this interesting discussion of cultural imperialism and cultural hybridity. And I'm not going to go into tons of detail, but there's this idea with cultural imperialism that some cultures dominate others. And for example, sometimes people will talk about the West in general, like Western Europe and North America in particular, kind of spreading their general culture everywhere, including material culture, and that's come to dominate around the world with globalization. And that is true. I mean, especially with multinational corporations and capitalism, and it has spread a lot of things. But it's so that is a partial truth, but at the same time, it's dangerous to see people around the world as passive victims. So people engage with incoming cultural knowledge, and so even if they are to a certain extent subject to some kind of colonial or imperial domination, they'll still modify what they get from dominant cultures. And they have an example there of Inuit peoples in the far north, for example, who have been affected, for better or for worse, by Christian missionaries, but who kind of infused Christianity with their own traditional values. And you see this a lot in indigenous cultures. If they've adopted some form of Christianity, often they've brought in their own traditional values into it. So so there's this kind of hybridity. So there's still a power difference and a relation of dominance, but it's not this complete passive victim thing. So that's an interesting discussion to read, and it's all tied into what culture is, essentially, because culture isn't this simple thing. It's something that is not static. So sometimes people talk about traditional culture because they'll have ideas that they try to live by, but the daily reality might still not look like how people were living thousands of years ago. And cultures everywhere have been through those changes, sometimes from the inside and sometimes because of contact with others. So a very complex topic. We're going to spend a big chunk of our semester talking about that, and what we're going to turn to in the next weeks, though, is the biological origins of culture and both biological and cultural evolution. So any questions about any of this, drop me a line.